Another race weekend done and over with, and another video to talk about what we saw. It's the 2025 Bahrain Grand Prix race recap. What's going on, guys, and welcome back to the channel. We're here to talk about what we saw today at the Bahrain Grand Prix round. What are we on now? 4 of the season. It's hard to believe we're already 4 rounds in, but it also feels like we've been going for a while now. It's the middle portion of this triple header. Next week we head to Saudi Arabia. Last week was Japan. We had a snoozer last week in Japan. We had a banger today in Bahrain. Let's just hope Saudi Arabia can live up to the expectations on it now. But before we get started, if you haven't already, subscribe down below. Join our little community. We'd love to have you, as well as leave a comment giving your race rating for the Bahrain Grand Prix. I'm sure all of us were very excited to see a race with some different strategy calls, some actual overtaking, and a lot of excitement up and down the field, unlike what we saw last time out in the Japanese Grand Prix. So I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. But in this video, we're going to be going over our quick hits, our weekend winners and losers, and then we'll wrap things up by talking about our predictions that we made before the weekend began and see how our Community Predictions Championship is shaping up. Let's get this thing started with our race quick hits. Where else do you start besides the front? Oscar Piastri perfection this weekend. We saw Oscar show up off of his Japanese Grand Prix weekend absolutely determined, unlike any I think we've seen before, and I think it showed both in his qualifying results and this race itself. He drove off into the distance quite literally. I know he didn't have, Lando right behind him pushing him, but that's not his fault. He started the front, he finished at the front, what was it, some 10 to 15 seconds up the road. Oscar had probably a pretty lonely weekend at the top, but that said, I'm sure he would take it 10 times out of 10. It's his 50th race Grand Prix start, and he gets his 4th win as well. And he has silently moved his way into a lot of talks with a lot of people who I think at the beginning of the season or going into the season who were talking only about Lando potentially challenging for the championship. But if Lando is going to have weekends like this and Oscar does what he did today, then I think there's going to be a lot of people who are going to talk about Oscar potentially in only his, third season in F1, maybe coming away with the championship himself. Lando better step it up because right now Oscar is looking very, very good. Let's go ahead. I want to talk about George Russell. This has been recorded after the stewards' decisions that no penalties be applied for Russell's DRS snafu that we saw during and then started talking about after the race. I know I, for one, was very surprised to see that note come flash up across the top of the screen for DRS infringement. At that point, we had heard George make some comments about the state of his car, which apparently was falling apart around him. If you could believe the radio messages going back and forth between them, even at one point saying that he might even lose the dash of his steering wheel. And so I think this is one where apparently he hit the radio button, which activated the DRS. But after, study and analysis, apparently he only gained like 200ths of a second, into which he probably lost 3/10 in the next corner. So they ultimately decided no penalty for George, which I consider to be a huge win, because what a weekend for George Russell. I mean, he, for whatever reason, just has a way around Bahrain. I predicted him to do very well in the weekend. We'll get there later. And I think he delivered above and beyond even my expectations, qualifying, at the front and ultimately coming away with a P2. He was being chased down by Lando and was able to hold back a much faster McLaren. In the grand scheme of things, this is a situation that George, I would have felt so bad for George if he had had this amazing weekend performance stripped away just because his car apparently didn't know whether it wanted to be a car or a pile of junk. So I feel really happy for George that he ends up keeping his P2 in the end. It was a masterful weekend from George Russell. We'll touch on Ferrari here a little bit. Obviously, I think Ferrari is sort of caught in a bit of a no man's land. I don't think they're definitely not as quick as McLaren. They're definitely right now, I think maybe even a step behind the Mercedes on from a weekend to weekend perspective. And I think it's very interesting that they really do need to bring some upgrades to try and take a step forward, because right now I think they have a driver lineup that is willing and begging for an opportunity to battle for wins. And it just right now it seems like they're just like a step and a half down from that front team McLaren and that second team, whichever one it is this whatever weekend. We saw Charles obviously get a good jump at the beginning of the race, and Lewis, starting lower down in the top 10, made his way, and they believe they finished P4 and 5 on track. And so at the end of the weekend, it's a very solid result, but at the same time, I know they would much rather prefer be fighting for race wins than picking up, the back half of the top end of the points. So it's a very good recovery from Lewis. Obviously, we know that his race pace is much better than his qualifying pace as of the last couple of years, but we have seen flashes of dominance, the flashes of, pace in qualifying like we saw in China. And so it's one of those things that I think they just need to give him a bit more of a stable car and be able to build and understand, everything about it. I think a lot of drivers who move teams are starting to sort of have to feel out the new cars. We've seen a lot of really experienced drivers move cars and have to, really sort of bed themselves into the team. I think Lewis is starting to hit that a little bit, but at the same time, when you're a 7-time world champion, you can't really be expected to wait that long. And so I think if Ferrari can give him a car to deal with it, I think we'll see some improved Ferrari performances. And Charles as well, he's been dealing with this basically since he got to Formula One outside of a couple of years at Sauber, so he already knows what to expect. But for whatever reason, it just seems like Ferrari are just kind of middling around where they are, and we'll see if they're able to take a step forward with some upgrades down the line. All right, next team I want to talk about is Red Bull, because double points finish, yay! Confidence? Maybe not so much. Yes, Red Bull get their first double points finish since, Las Vegas of 2024. And so it's been a bit of a bumpy ride here for Red Bull down the end of last season and to start this year. Obviously, there's a lot of drama surrounding that second Red Bull seat. And I think even Max Verstappen is starting to feel a little bit of that pain as well. There were multiple instances in this race where Max came over the radio complaining about one thing or another. And as well, I think there's even probably as a driver, even more frustrating aspect of the automatic pit release lights not working. And so we saw both multiple times with Max and Yuki that when they pit, the automatic lights they have triggered, so when the car gets dropped, that it'll turn green so that they let the driver know, hey, you're good to go. There were multiple times where you saw Max and Yuki have to hesitate, going, though the light didn't change, what do I do, before ultimately pulling away. We saw that led to multiple 4-point something whatever pit stops, and I'm sure a lot of frustration. Max also had an issue getting one of his tires off, and so the usually very reliable Red Bull pit stop crew probably had a lot to do with a little bit of Max's frustration over the course of this one. Ultimately, thanks to the safety car, and to be fair, the Red Bull still very good pace compared to the rest of the lower midfield and back markers, was able to make his way back up and still finish inside the points. And Yuki Tsunoda also finishes P9 as well. So a double points finish for Red Bull, but at the same time, I think there's still a very, very, very long way to go before either driver is really going to be comfortable and probably happy. Specifically, Max Verstappen, because the team in the car that's built specifically around him, all of a sudden looking really tough to watch, especially after what happened last week in Japan. It must be extremely frustrating when you just do not know what you're going to get from weekend to weekend. Building off of that Red Bull comment, I want to specifically call out Yuki Tsunoda being the first driver to get points in that second seat this season. We obviously saw a lot of the struggles that Liam Lawson went in over the course of the first 2 rounds of the season, and Yuki to a certain degree had a couple of problems in Japan, but I think that was more just down to the race itself. We saw a lot of those issues up and down the field, so I don't hold it against him too much. But nonetheless, he makes it into Q3 in qualifying, ultimately qualifying P10. It is what it is at that point, but ultimately comes back in the race and finishes inside the points, getting his first points under the Red Bull banner. So fantastic race from Yuki. Just wanted to mention it here. It's time. It's time. I busted out every time something good happens. Haas double points following a qualifying session that left me absolutely heartbroken. Ollie Behrman qualifies P20. Esteban Ocon crashes out of Q2, ultimately starting P14 thanks to the penalties to the Mercedes. At the same time, boy oh boy, I was feeling it, and I was really not looking forward to race day today. Ultimately, let Haas cook for a minute, because boy oh boy did Ayuki Komatsu and the strategy team come up with an absolute banger. We get Esteban pitting early, undercutting basically the entire field, falling in line with what at the time was a very good position behind Max Verstappen before Max fell back in the end. That's besides the point. And he ultimately ran inside the top 10 for the rest of the race. The safety car did leave me a little concerned, but at the same time, his hard tires, which were definitely not the preferred tire, were more than enough to go to the end and keep their life enough, as the softs, especially a lot of drivers chose to go onto, wore down, and he was able to finish in the, what was it, P8. And so we had a P8 finish from him and a P10 finish from Ollie Behrman. That's right, Ollie Behrman went P20 to points in this one. And oh, it was so fun to watch. He gained, what was it, 4 or 5 positions basically on race start, ultimately finding himself just a couple of positions behind Esteban there at the beginning. He ended up going longer-ish in that second stint before ultimately getting to pit under the safety car. I believe he came out in 11th, 12th, or 13th, that sort of range, before ultimately making his way forward and finishing P10, holding back even a Mercedes of Kimi Antonelli. He wasn't a bit of a train up to his teammates, but at the same time, he showed a lot of really good stuff over the course of this one. That has me really excited to see what he can do the rest of this year. Holding off a Mercedes, especially your former teammate in F2, must have been a good feeling, and I think we saw how excited he was after it was all over. I'm sure he much rather would have qualified a little better and maybe seen what would have happened from there, but considering the damage limitation from starting literally last on the grid to finishing in the points, I'll take it every single time. We'll wrap this sort of thing up with a double-edged sword here of absolutely shout out to the Bahrain Grand Prix. I think it delivered like a lot of us wanted it to after Japan ended up being kind of the snoozer that it was. I think we were all a little nervous going to Bahrain, which should have the recipe for good racing, and it absolutely delivered every single moment. Outside of some technical details from both the team side and F1 and the broadcast team side, I think this one delivered absolutely fantastically. You saw a lot of action up and down the grid outside of Oscar Piastri. But it was a lot of moments, and a lot of, really close, tense moments. That race felt like it took 5 hours, and I think I blinked at the beginning when I felt like the race should almost be over, and it wasn't even lap 20 yet. So we saw action basically all the way through. As a Haas fan, I was dying those last few laps because you knew Ollie was being chased down by a much faster Mercedes, and Esteban on his used hard tires were getting chased down by, albeit a bit of a touch and go second Red Bull seat, but at the same time, it's still a Red Bull, it's still a Mercedes. They were able to hold off both. So it was a lot of fun over the course of the entire race, but I do want to talk about the other side, which is, can F1 and Liberty Media just get their broadcasting situation figured out? Losing the timing tree halfway through the race, for a good chunk of this race, left a lot of people, including myself, just absolutely dumbfounded at what was going on up and down the grid. And it really just makes you think about how often did you just watch the timing tree to get an idea of what's going on for when it's not getting shown on television. Especially as a fan of a team like Haas, a lot of the time we're not getting shown on television, and so it's hard to know exactly what's going on. And so even when they had the tree on there, but the live timing was all messed up, it made it so much harder to watch, and I'm begging for them to get it figured out. It seems like every start of the season they always have a couple of moments like this, but it's like it'd be really nice if they could just get it figured out off the jump. Please. All right, let's go ahead and move on to our weekend winners and losers, and I think these are going to be, pretty solid choices. I don't think anybody would complain too much one way or another. Let's begin with our weekend winner, and I'm going with Yuki Tsunoda. I think it has to be. I really wanted to almost pull the homer and pick Haas. That felt like a little too biased towards my team, and so ultimately I'm going with Yuki Tsunoda, the first driver in the second Red Bull seat to score points this season, getting Red Bull, like I mentioned earlier, their first double points finish since Vegas 24, and so it was a very good weekend from Yuki. I think I was excited to see him bounce back from Japan, which we've talked about plenty at this point, and I think he absolutely did it. It's still only his second race in the Red Bull, and he's also had no off weeks to really get up to speed as well, and so I think he's doing a very solid job when we realistically look at it. At the same time, I think you can continue to see the struggles that Liam Lawson was having, and so I think ultimately, while harsh, it does seem like Yuki was the right call to jump into the Red Bull for starting in Japan, but it really still begs the question of what Red Bull was thinking when they promoted Lawson over Yuki anyway. But Yuki absolutely proving a lot of the doubters wrong and really proving himself to the team and Red Bull that, hey, I've been here the whole time, and it's about time you started giving me the respect I deserve. So congratulations, Yuki. Not only I think you're probably not only mine, but a lot of people's weekend winner. Let's move on to weekend loser. This one always feels so bad, but I think this one is pretty obvious. I think it has to be Carlos Sainz. I think it's just only fitting that our weekend winner takes out our weekend loser. Carlos, for the first time, I think we really saw the potential that he had in the Williams. Obviously, during F1 preseason testing, we saw Carlos really gel with the car around Bahrain, and I think we saw a little bit remnant of that here this weekend. We finally see him really start to get the measure of the car. He makes it into Q3, his best qualifying, I believe, of the year. Don't fact check me on that. He ultimately looks like he was running very solidly, potentially looking at scoring some pretty decent points before ultimately a collision with Yuki Tsunoda coming out of turn 1 ultimately left him with a me-sized, hole in his side pod. And ultimately he unfortunately had to retire just because the damage was obviously far too great. And it really sucked to see because it really seemed like the first instance this season, outside of maybe the beginning of Australia before he ultimately crashed out under the safety car, but it just seemed like this was the first time we really saw him get up to speed. We obviously saw Albon in his qualifying snafu have him be dropped out in Q1, and so it really seemed like a good opportunity for Sainz to really step up, score those points for Williams before ultimately just unlucky, wrong plays, wrong time, wrong driver going up against him. And unfortunately, he DNF'd from this one when it looked like he was going to be in pretty solid position at that point. So it's really unfortunate to say, Carlos, but I'm sorry, but you're my weekend loser. All right, let's get it on. Predictions, results from what we saw before the weekend began. We'll begin with my pick for biggest positive surprise. I went with Esteban Ocon. I think after a Japanese Grand Prix, I think we were due to see a good Esteban performance. And I think we almost, it was a little touch and go there for a minute. Obviously him crashing out in Q2 on his first lap definitely put a bit of a dampener on the weekend itself. But at the same time, a brilliant recovery drive, a strategy masterclass from Haas has him finishing P8 and holding off a Red Bull and ultimately another Mercedes behind, but a very, very good race. I think that was probably about the maximum that we could have expected from Esteban in this race, considering his strategy, ending up on the hard tires like that. But absolutely a point for me there. I think nobody would have expected Haas points seeing their qualifying, but ultimately we'll take it as we see it. So that's 1 point for me. Now, unfortunately for me, my biggest disappointment almost came true, but in a way that I think I'm totally fine losing this point. My pick for biggest disappointment was Ollie Behrman, and I think this was unfortunately looking pretty on considering he qualified P20. But going from last place to points, absolutely no points from my prediction, but points for me because I got to see one of my favorite young drivers put in an absolute banger of a drive, finishing P10 and holding up for Mercedes. Yeah, I'm going to take that every single time. Thank you very much. We'll move on now to our qualifying predictions, and unfortunately, this was a weekend where we got a Lando Norris. We'll just go with struggles in qualifying. My predictions was a Lando Norris pole, an Oscar Piastri P2, and a George Russell P3, which was potentially looking very, very on until Lando decided that he just didn't want to get a decent lap in, ultimately starting in whatever it was, P5 or 6. And Oscar ended up stepping up prominently and taking pole position, with George coming in and finishing P2 on the front row. So ultimately, half point for my Piastri pick, half point for my Russell pick, 1 total point for qualifying. As we move on now to my prediction for the race podium. And this is another one which, if Lando had just qualified where we would have expected him to, I almost could have nailed this one. I had a Lando Norris win, an Oscar Piastri P2, and a George Russell P3. Obviously, Lando ends up finishing on the podium, but at the same time, it was not a win. So half point down the list. Obviously, Oscar won, George came second, and Lando third. So I got the entire podium correct, just they were all in wrong positions. So 1.5 points if you add it all up. Now I'm currently sitting on 2.5 points, or 3.5 points rather, if I can do math, for the race weekend. And we wrap things up with my one crazy prediction, which I firmly believe would have come in, especially after what we saw with Oscar. I predicted that McLaren as a team, aka both drivers, finish more than 10 seconds ahead of the next non-McLaren car, which would in this case would have been George Russell. Oscar ended up winning by between 10 to 15 seconds, so I think this was looking very, very on. And so who knows what we would have had happen if Lando ended up qualifying at the front. But I think this was very nearly on until Lando ultimately fell down the order and ended up fighting with George there for P2 in the end. So no point on that one. So 3.5 points for me on the weekend. Very, very solid. And if we take a look now at our Community Championship standings, we now have a tie for third. And so we'll start at the top. We have British TTG still sitting at the top with 14 points. We have F1 Inferno just half a point behind, 13.5 points. I and Sentinel 40 are tied for third with 12.5 points. And ultimately, Andrew and Spectral, who have been in and out making their predictions every week, sit at the back with 5.5 and 4.5 points, respectively. If you're interested in jumping in, it's never too late to join the Community Predictions Championship. It's a lot of fun. And ultimately, it's almost like the smack talk and bragging rights is more important than getting the actual points themselves. So if you're interested in joining our Community Predictions Championship, head to the link down below, join the Discord, and every week leading up to the Grand Prix, I'll make a call for these exact same predictions that we made here, and you'll have your opportunity to jump in and see who can cook the best. But guys, that only leaves one question remaining. What is next? Next out, we have the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. Another very, one of my more enjoyable race weekends, I think, on the calendar. It's one of those that's very fast, it's very technical, and you have to be almost inch perfect everywhere you go. It's really going to come down to who has the bravery and commitment to making moves stick, to making qualifying laps count, and seeing who can, survive the Jeddah Corniche circuit. It's going to be a lot of fun. It'll be the last round of this triple header before we get a little reprieve as we head now towards, the continuing on in this F1 season. We have a lot of races left, but it's only one upcoming. The Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. Who do you think is going to be on the podium? Stay tuned, because our predictions video will be coming out only in a couple of days. So once again, if you're interested in getting in on the Predictions Championship, head to the link down below, join on in. But guys, that is going to wrap it up for me here in this one. Bahrain delivered in every way we could have ever wanted it to. I hope that Saudi Arabia does the same. It'd be nice to build a little momentum as we continue to see different teams take steps forward and some taking steps back. Who's going to get it right? Only time will tell. But guys, that is going to wrap it up for me here in this one. Once again, if you haven't already, subscribe down below. Leave a comment giving your race rating for the Bahrain Grand Prix. And if you made it this far into the video, leave a like rating. It really helps me out. But guys, we'll be back in a few days for our predictions video, and we'll be race week in only a couple of hours. But for now, guys, that'll do it for me here, and I'll see you in the next one.